Welcome to our presentation today, Value Undiscovered. We're looking forward to meeting with you and having a conversation today about CapEx, expenditures, optimization, and how we reduce risk and cost. I have some special guests with us today from the industry, and we're looking forward to having this conversation with you. Thanks for joining us, and let's just get started. Okay, great. So here we have us today on the far right side of your screen. Hopefully, we have Phil Jones, and then we have Dan Coombs. And let's start out with Phil and say, Phil, can you tell those of us watching today who you are and what do you do?
Yeah, I'm the Global VP of Business Development with Copperleaf, and my job and my team's job is to work with clients on improving their capital efficiency and asset management, and just basically getting better results in a value-based decision-making process.
And, Phil, we'll get into it a little bit more, later as we move forward. But Phil has a technical background as well as working at Copperleaf today. And I really like that combination and how it comes together, the industry experience as well as, working with Copperleaf in the market development. And then we have Dan Coombs. Dan is also from industry, and I appreciate you being with us today, Dan. Could you tell our viewers who you are and what do you do?
Yes, a pleasure, Mark. Thank you for this. Yeah, I'm a retired industry executive. Most recently, I retired in August of 2020 from LyondellBassell, and I was executive vice president responsible for global manufacturing and projects for that company. I had other roles there, which I was responsible for business lines and products. And then previously, I was a senior vice president for Chevron Phillips, where I also had business line responsibility, but retired from that company. Responsible for their global manufacturing group as well. So it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. It's really good. I always like being able to bring the industry experience. Phil, you had some experience working in industry as well, previously, right?
Yeah. I mean, I started off actually my career. I'm an engineer by education. Started off working in Schlumberger in the measure well drilling division, designing downhole tools, before I learned that I actually like sitting between the problem that people have and designers who want to design it. And then I basically moved into customer facing roles over time.
Very good. Well, listen, it's going to be a great discussion because I like bringing together, current day technology, our discussion of value undiscovered, and how you can be looking at value and CapEx optimization and bringing it together with real life industry and helping us to be able to align those to make sure that we understand the problems. And speaking of problems, our first slide we have that we're going to bring up today is an agenda where we'll talk about what you can expect. So basically, we're going to start out today by taking a little bit of a look at challenges and trends, and then we're going to look at how people are really maximizing in the industry capital efficiency through planning, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how you really just get started. So let's just go ahead and jump right in, and we'll start by talking about some of the challenges that we're seeing in the industry. And maybe I'll start with you, Dan, and say, Dan, can you kind of give us, you come directly from industry, you recently retired from, major chemical and petroleum companies, oil and gas companies in the past. Can you tell us really what are some of the recent challenges that you've seen and some of the trends that you're seeing within the industry?
Yeah, yes, of course, Mark. Thank you. I think, one of the really key challenges is how we invest capital in the company. And investing capital is really how companies create and sustain competitive advantage in how they manage risk. So all capital management, the basics start with risk management. And risk management sounds easy, but there's multiple categories. Let's say safety, environment, regulatory, reliability, and then multiple business lines, and then multiple plants. So you really have this very complex network of projects that are difficult to compare across business lines, plants, and categories of risk. And so having a process that helps manage risk consistently and on a value-based basis is really critical, because ultimately every capital dollar you invest, even including what we call sustaining capital, should create value for the company. So that's really, really important. And then the next kind of category is around business goals. And in general, after you've sustain the company and manage that risk, you want to invest capital that helps the company improve its earnings. So that we call that profitable growth. And the big projects get the headlines, the mega projects, the new plants and the new business lines, et cetera, or a big M&A seems to get all the headlines. But all companies have a whole host of profitable growth projects that are much smaller. And they might compete with the sustaining capital that we talked about for risk management. And they're, again, very complicated because multiple business lines, multiple plants, and multiple timeframes of value. So having, again, a process that really can, really evaluate, in many cases, thousands of projects on value across both risk and profitable growth categories is really critical. And then today we talk about environmental, social, and governance issues. And all these chemical companies have long-term goals that are much longer than what they have published in the past, 20, 30, 40, and 50. And this is good for the planet. It's good for our employees and communities, and it's good for our customers. And so it's really, really important to do. But it's, again, a lot of these goals of reaching these more sustainable products and environmental footprints are going to take a lot of capital, and a good number of these companies don't know exactly what they're going to do today to reach those goals. So that's why I think this having the agility in your process to manage capital is even more important now more than ever, because it's always been important with economic cycles and capacity cycles. But now the ESG on top of it is going to really create some interesting and difficult capital decisions for the chemical industry in the future. And so I think it's more important now than ever. So kind of shift gears back to you and Phil to talk a little bit more about how to compare projects.
Well, those are three really good categories, of challenges and sort of trends that are going on. I wanted to maybe ask a follow-up question of Phil. Phil, why do you think that we're singling out one business goal like ESG? Why are we having to say balancing ESG and other business goals? What are you seeing other people doing?
Well, I mean, ESG specifically, it's just become such a big driver in organizations, particularly, carbon intensive organizations, to figure out how to reduce their carbon impact on the planet. And they're having to balance what we call what traditionally might have been business as usual decisions. And so how do they put those on some common scale of value, some common framework for making those decisions? It's just greatly jacked up the complexity of decision making in many organizations, is essentially why that's called out.
Okay. Well, so you use that word of comparing, maybe projects. And so maybe we'll go to the next slide that we have. And I understand that you were going to take a minute to try to sort of compare, why is it a challenge to make investment decisions?
Yeah. And probably a couple slides here, but this one, like if you think, Dan said the last thing he touched on was improving decision-making agility, right? And so I'm actually going to talk through some of the things that make that difficult, right? So when you just take two projects, and this is a simple sort of replace an end-of-life boiler and upgrading a heat exchanger, they could both be sustaining capital projects, but you could bring in other types of project, ESG projects, for example. When you first start looking at those projects, you're generally looking at the costs and the schedules, and that's pretty easy to compare. When you start getting into the benefits, that's when it can become more difficult to compare these projects. So if they have O&M savings, that's still in dollars, is pretty straightforward. But when you start getting into some other metrics like safety, improved safety on one project, but there's no improved safety on the other, GHG emissions impact on one project, not on the other, different reliability impacts, you start dealing with different metrics. And so how do you compare project A to project B on some common economically calibrated scale? If you don't have something like that, you end up basically having to talk it out. You end up debating these two projects and which do you think is the most valuable for the company, right? And so that's what happens in organizations when they're trying to figure out how they look at a portfolio of decisions. They have to have a lot of debate about them as to what's the right thing to do. So if you take that and move to the next slide, take that idea and you scale it up to what's really happening in those organizations. They might have hundreds or thousands, and in some cases, tens of thousands of investments they have to make decisions on. And the little spider web in there is just showing the complexity, the interrelation between some of those project dependencies. And if you do this, you need to do this, and you have to do this before this. And that just adds increasing complexity to the decision making. And like maybe we'll take a moment to have Dan comment on what this was like for him and some of the senior roles he held in the chemical industry before he retired.
Yeah. Yes, Phil. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a very accurate description it's hard enough to just compare a couple projects like you discussed, but you literally have thousands of projects in there, and a lot of systems might be spreadsheet driven at each plant and each business, and everybody that puts a project in this system is passionate about it. They want to do it. There's a good reason to do it. But so how do you really level that playing field and evaluate those in an efficient way? And especially as you work through a capital budget, which generally you ask for more than you can have. And so it's always a bit constrained, and not everything that everybody wants to do will get done. So it becomes more of a needs versus wants in most cases. And so there's a lot of work on adjusting scope and scale of projects and getting the right projects in the list. And it becomes a very difficult process. And for most companies, they go through it on a yearly basis. And so it presents quite a challenge, and it's an area that can be improved.
So Phil, I heard you starting out by saying, look, at even comparing two projects together, finding common elements to be able to compare, in a framework is a challenge. And, it's kind of mind boggling to me when you start talking about how do you align and compare hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands. I think I was on your website and I saw one of your, customers say they might have had as many as 1 million assets that they were trying to, compare or align or make decisions on. Dan, is that realistic? Is there really that kind of volume of decisions that have to be made and aligned in how you spend capital?
Yeah. And I think, the other complex thing, more so than an operating budget, is the capital budget changes every year. Projects come in, projects finish and leave. Projects have surprises during the year, right? So there's a lot of other adjustments that happen through that process. But in my experience, a large chemical company will literally have thousands of projects in execution at the same time. Very typical. And that landscape changes over time because those projects are all in different phases. Some of them are going through the system and leaving, and some of them are entering the system. And you've got, it's just a complex network of different challenges to manage. So again, having a system that does that well is really a big advantage, because then you can really think about the capital plan as opposed to just building the capital plan.
So Phil, I understand that then you have to have a way of doing a common analysis or comparison. How do you approach that on a manual kind of a basis?
Well, and Dan touched on this earlier when he's talking about agility and being able to make decisions kind of at scale across these hundreds or thousands of investments. And you really get to this idea of, Dan said, everything you do with capital should drive value for the business. Well, what is value? How do you define value? And this cartoon shows different people with different perspectives on what value is. And the thing is, they're all correct. Every person in this cartoon and every person in your organization is trying to achieve certain objectives. And those objectives may vary by their location in the company or their role. But ultimately, all those things drive value for the business. So the trick is, and this is where most organizations struggle the most, is how do you define value in a way so anybody in that company can describe their project, their initiative on that scale of value, and so everybody understands what they're talking about, right? And it's establishing that value framework is how we think about that is so important in creating that environment where everybody understands what drives value.
So that's interesting, because you're not saying that, well, this isn't valuable to this person or it's not valuable to this person. You're saying that everybody has value from their own perspective, and the challenge then becomes in evaluating that value and what the overall impact is to the organization.
Yeah, and calibrating all those things onto some common framework. And our view is the best way to do that is to do that where it's an economically calibrated framework, because everybody's can translate things to dollars, and so that's usually easier for use for calibration.
Well, let's take a step forward and kind of see how this sort of works. And that the next piece of our agenda here was maximizing capital efficiency through planning. And so, Phil, if I could just ask you, is that I understand there is a lot of this happening in the industry today. How widespread is this idea of optimizing value through frameworks like this?
So this is a list of actually Copperleaf clients that are doing this. And the interesting thing is, if you look at them you'll see a lot of them are regulated utilities, right? And regulated utilities have developed out of necessity skill sets around doing this, because they spend a lot of their time developing plans and explaining the plans to different sets of stakeholders, both internal and external, including regulators and the ratepayers. So they've had to become more consistent and transparent in how they make those decisions and how those decisions drive value for their stakeholders. So that's why you see so many utilities here. But ultimately, they're solving the same problem of an industrial customer is trying to solve. How do we get the most value for our decisions, and how do we explain it to different sets of stakeholders you might be dealing with, both internal and external?
Okay, well, that makes sense. So this isn't a new idea. It's actually quite broad and been going on for quite a few years, I see. So how would someone go about, tackling it? How do we go about tackling this challenge, that really exists?
Yes, I'll jump in on this graphic. It's one of my favorite ones. I think we've talked about this, but managing risk and achieving the company strategies are ultimately what creates value for your company. And agility is a key element here, because you're not shooting at a fixed target. Things are moving all the time. So I think that's why all four of those elements are really critical. But what I really want to focus on is the governance itself, and kind of ask the viewers, do you have a transparent process? Efficient? Is it effective? Can you defend your capital decisions and those sorts of issues? Do you feel good about it? Do you feel like you have an effective process that really manages your capital plan and execution based upon value, and can adapt as things change around you? And I think, again, in my experience, I felt like the companies I worked for worked really hard to have an effective process to do that. So my next question is, how efficient is that process? And that was one that maybe I couldn't answer on quite as a positive a note. And one of the reasons why I'm so much interested in what Copperleaf is doing with their clients right now is, not only is the process that they'll work with their customers to deploy effective, but it's also efficient. And an efficient process and capital governance allows you to do scenarios and scenario thinking, not just sensitivities around a plan. It allows you, when things like COVID happen and you have to change your plan. My prior company, this was announced publicly, but we went from a $2.4 billion plan to a $1.9 billion plan, and had to make that adjustment on the fly during the year, after we were already in execution for 3 turnarounds and 1 major capital project. It's very difficult to do, and it created a lot of work, and a lot of that could have been done more efficiently. So we'll talk more about that later. But again, this governance that Phil talked about, that is so required in the utility industry, based upon ratepayers getting their money's worth, I think is also very important for the chemicals industry. And I think it will be even more so important for the ESG requirements that we'll be taking on in the future. So key issues there. Both effective and efficient processes are going to be the requirement for good capital planning.
So Dan, I like that. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Please. No, please go ahead, Dan. Yep.
No, I was just going to say, talk a little bit about the capital planning process, maybe from my perspective too, in the next slide, if we could maybe just advance one here. Oh, that's Phil. Pardon me. I want to let Phil do that, and I'll make more comments here at the end. But
well, that's a good segue, because I wanted to ask you this: is that if we're thinking about going from you talked about governance and the importance of governance and the importance of agility, is that Phil, how do we put a framework and an agreed upon framework in place, governance, and how do we, still maintain agility when we're trying to put a structure around something? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, and maybe the way to walk through it is to kind of just go through this very high level process and talk through these steps, because this essentially, all those companies you saw on that earlier slide are following a process at a high level that looks very similar to this. And we want to break it down that way. So I'm going to walk through this, start off with, how do you establish that decision-making framework? How do you use it to evaluate projects? How do you optimize portfolios of projects to find the most value and explore different versions of those plans? And ultimately, how do you analyze all that and approve a plan for your business? So let's step through it. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. That establishing a decision-making framework, that's really focused on what are your understanding your strategic objectives. And then for any strategic objective, what are the set of metrics or measures that you can use to quantify the alignment of a project with any particular strategic objective? So you'll typically have many different metrics that might line up with each strategic objective, and a project or an initiative in your company is going to hit one or more of those metrics, but would likely never hit all of them unless the framework itself is really quite compact, which we have seen before. But that's the first thing you do is go through a process, and just our company Copperleaf and some of our consulting partners are very good at facilitating this to come up with what's the framework through which you make decisions with, right? And now we're going to move forward to the next slide and talk about how do you use that framework, right? So you'll have different types of projects flowing in to your organization. You have some that are on the sustainment needs of the asset base. You could have growth projects, minor to large. You know, they don't have to be of a certain size. You might have EHS or ESG investments, other types of investments. All of those basically get assessed using that value framework we established in step 1. And when I say assess the value, that looks at what we call sort of negative components of value, like costs. That could be capital costs, O&M costs, could be resource consumption. And then you look at also the positive benefits of those investments or value. Could be things like capacity increases, GHG reductions, reliability improvements, any number of things that would be considered benefits. So that valuation is looking at more than just like financial NPV. It's looking at all the different costs and benefits associated with each one of those candidate projects. If we move to the next step, this is where you get into some really powerful stuff where you've got assessed the value of these projects, and you understand that value kind of changes over time. If you decide to defer a project, that project might be more or less valuable. So you got to start looking at it at this portfolio level and say, how do I look at all the projects I've evaluated? How do I bring in things like constraints? Like I may have capital constraints or OpEx constraints. I may have resource constraints. I might just have timing constraints, timing windows in which I have to do things. You can also have targets. You might have risk reduction targets or GHG reduction targets. How do I factor all that in and optimize a plan that, given all those projects and constraints and targets, given that, what's the best plan I can come up with that generates the most value, right? That's the fundamental thing that optimization is about in this step, is how do I generate the most value possible given that set of information? And then you can do some really cool stuff after that. You can change assumptions. You can change scenarios, basically. What if I did this? What if I reduced this? What if I changed this target? How would my plan look different? And you can develop a bunch of different scenarios, different versions of your plan, where you're kind of exploring the edges of what stays the same between plans and what changes. And then the last step I was going to talk about, and actually I think Dan's going to talk to this one, is once you've gone through all this planning and analysis and you have these different scenarios, talk about analyzing and approving those projects or those plans.
So yeah, thank you, Phil. I think this is a really nice graphic here to kind of wrap up the process, and companies go through this. But again, almost all chemical companies use risk matrices, and they can run different capital plans and show the effect on that risk matrices, what is and isn't acceptable, what their target levels are, and how soon they need to get projects into that green zone. Also elements of strategy, some sort of spider diagram that really determines how close you were getting to strategy based upon how much capital is spent. But the one that I really like on this chart that comes out of this tool is it can look at deliverability too. So in this case, this is a 4-year plan. A lot of companies have 5, 6 or more year plans, but that would also balance, in this case, capital dollars by year, but also the resources, the amount of people that it takes to actually execute the project. So again, as you're looking at balancing your plan and using a tool to do that, this is where you can really balance all 3 of these things. So you're balancing risk and strategy, and you're getting a plan that you can actually deliver, that you have the funds to do for a multi-year period, and you have the resources to do. And resources to me are even more important because, again, people are really passionate about their projects, and a lot of the smaller risk-based projects and profitable growth projects use the same resources to execute them. So if you get everything you ask for, you may or may not be able to actually execute the project, which then creates delays and inefficiencies in the process, and you don't really get the best value out of it. So one of the things I really like about this tool and the process, it really allows you to balance all those things and come up with a plan that you have the best chance of executing at the best value. So I really kind of enjoy that, and kind of leads into the next chart too that I'd like to talk about. Is for most of my career, I would say, first of all, capital planning is more difficult than operating planning because it changes by its very nature. You know, you pretty much operate the same assets year to year, and you kind of know market demand, supply demand, and impact on margins and all that sort of thing. And you know things that are affecting costs, and you can kind of adjust those year to year. And it's seemingly a very almost a continuous process, the operating budget. But capital by its nature changes, and it becomes a bit more batch oriented because some years cash flows may be better than others. Some years you have strategic projects, so the planning is, capital is more constrained, or for other reasons, and it becomes almost a batch process. And businesses and plants and central groups all work hard and end up coming up with a lot of spreadsheets, come up with a number. The number looks a little high, so we go back and adjust, and we're kind of baking a cake, and we're trying to get the right ingredients in it, and sometimes it doesn't turn out quite so well. So the ultimate goal, I think, is to have a more continuous process and make it easier, because I think there's so much work that goes into a batch planning process, and generally some frustration by some passionate people. And in a continuous process, if you have the right tools to do it, which I believe the Copperleaf process is a very good tool to do this, there's more strategic thinking going on in this, and that it requires less effort to get a better plan. And to go from batch to continuous, you don't have to go at it all in one go. You can take steps, and it's kind of customized to the individual. But getting from batch to continuous planning and capital really adds a lot of value, because folks are then thinking about the capital plan and how to execute it better, instead of just trying how to develop it, and some frustration around that. So I really believe, having this tool that is both effective and efficient and continuous really can create a lot of value around capital planning and execution.
Dan, let me ask you a question. Earlier on in our discussion here, you mentioned that you were affected by a world event and you had to do a big replan, on capital. How big of an exercise is that normally for a large company to do such a big replan, of an adjustment in a capital budget like that?
Yeah, I think oftentimes it can take 2 or 3 months. I think of the Great Recession in 08, 09. I think of COVID is another example. I've had some replans on major capital execution where projects weren't going exactly to plan, and it affected every other project in the company. So we had to do replans. That's happened more than once. And so it can be an economic cycle, can be a capacity cycle, can be an industry event, that all force you to go back to the drawing board and do replanning. And I think most companies do that from time to time, but just the one big plan that people do, often that whole planning process might take 3 months. And then you're done for a while, and you kind of monitor and watch it. And if there's a major redo, it still takes, literally about 3 months. And again, it can be a very frustrating process for people, because they thought they had something and then they don't. And again, everybody is trying to get what they need, hopefully, as opposed to what they want. But at the end of the day, that process can be challenging for a company and for the people that do it inside the company.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Phil, I wanted to flip that question back over to you and say, if we looked at the key elements that make it easier to be more agile, Dan was talking about being agile. How do we how do we go into a process which is more agile and more flexible?
So I think the way I look at it is that process I was just outlining with those 6 steps, that's the general approach. You need that process to be, bedded into the organization. You need a tool set like that. You can't really do this well in Excel, right? So you need a tool that's designed to support that sort of process. And that's actually why Copperleaf exists as a company. And then once you have those, you move into this more dynamic planning process. And as Dan mentioned, you can migrate from a purely batch process to some continuous planning process, kind of at your own pace. You're not forced to do that. But I ask you to think about it like this. If you fast forward and you have an organization that says, we want to get better at this, we want to get more agile at decision making, they'll go on a journey where the budget becomes a push button view of their plan at that point in time. A quarter later, how does their budget look? It's a push button view of their plan and how it's changed at that point in time. Their 5-year plan is a push button view of a 5-year plan at that point in time. So you don't have to go through this big lift every time you do budgeting, because you've turned it into this continuous process, because that's what planning actually is in real life. It's always going on. It's always changing. But most organizations don't have the ability to adapt their plan on the fly like that. So the budget becomes just a snapshot, as an example.
So Phil, earlier on in our discussion, you showed us a bunch of companies that were, in the process of doing more of this, having better frameworks, doing more continuous planning. Can you tell us what the impact or outcome is of doing something like this?
Yeah, I'll walk you through some of the major kind of points there. So one thing is, when you go through this process where you can start evaluating things on a common value framework, then optimizing within your constraints and targets, you can reduce the spend. Like, you can reduce your spend to achieve the same risk levels by like 20%. And we've seen higher than that. We think that's actually a relatively conservative number. So you're talking about capital efficiency from a risk mitigation perspective. That's a good example. You'll get other, value improving benefits as well. The 12% item, the next one over, that's just improvements in your ROI across your whole portfolio. Like, you'll get more benefit, more value than if you just basically stack ranked them in a spreadsheet, which is where most companies are coming from when we meet with them the first time. So that's a significant thing. The improved planning efficiency, the next one over, once you get into this process, everything from people submitting investment ideas to them being evaluated to looking at things at a portfolio level and optimizing and comparing scenarios and eventually approving a plan, all the time, you save a ton of time in that process. And if you look at the executive management side of that, when you're trying to understand a plan and the impacts of a plan and whether it makes sense, that time can be reduced even further. One of our clients has a case study that reduced that by 80%. All of this leads to just improved decision agility and improved value extraction from the planning process, right? It's all very powerful stuff.
So Phil, just for my own benefit, can you give me kind of the range of dollars that maybe a company would spend in capital? Because if you're talking about a 20% improvement, I mean, those are some pretty big numbers, aren't they?
Yeah, they can be big numbers. I mean, a lot of the organizations we work with have somewhere between 500 million and say $2 billion capital budgets. We have some clients that have upwards of, north of $7 billion per year capital budgets. And yeah, when you start even just tweaking, getting a few percent out of that, it's a pretty overwhelming benefit, right? But it takes clients, companies have to be willing to sort of say, yeah, to get those benefits, we're going to change how we think about planning and how we think about value. And if they're willing to do that, this is the kind of thing they can get out of it.
Those numbers are so big, they're pretty hard to ignore. That's really big. Maybe let me go to the next piece of our agenda here. Is it it's a little bit about how somebody would really get started. If somebody's thinking to themselves, hey, I am on a journey and we're already doing these things. And, Dan, you brought up that, you have a requirement with that kind of fiduciary responsibility, to be effective. I mean, you have to mitigate risk. You have to be safe. You have to meet regulatory requirements. You have to meet your company's goals and objectives. And so, you have to be effective. You have to put a process in place that's effective. But now if you're saying, I need to continue to mature down my journey and I need to be more efficient, how would we really even get started? Phil, can you sort of help us, talk about that a little bit? How would somebody even get started?
Yeah. So the way I look at this, and actually can probably move on to the next slide, just in terms of talking about a starting point, is organizations get overwhelmed about making these changes. They're like, I'm not sure where to start. There's so much to do, so many improvements I can make. My organization is so big. And the conversation we always have is like, where are you at today? Like, how are you making decisions today? How does that work? And we're trying to find which parts of that are the most challenging, the most difficult, or the most frustrating. And that's generally where we find the right starting point. So I'll give you some examples of what that might look like. It might look like you have a large organization with 15 affiliate companies, and each one of those affiliates has multiple lines of business. But it could be one of those organizations, a line of business, or the whole affiliate is really wanting to make improvements. So they're feeling more acute pain around this. And that's the starting point for that organization. And then from there, they might, over some longer period of time, expand and use it across the enterprise. We have many, many clients who have done that, but they didn't start at the enterprise level, right? So there is always a starting point, and it's mostly the art form here is don't get overwhelmed by the possibility of all these improvements you can make. Work with us to find a place to start and then grow from there.
Yeah, I think that's really so valuable of a perspective to have, Phil, because many times we look at the big challenge of this big challenge that we have, or the big, series of problems that we have in front of us, and we get a little bit frozen, and we don't really move forward. That's one thing I see. The second thing I see also is that many times people are in a certain series of operations and it's running effectively. Okay. And so it's a little bit difficult to say, how do we change something in order to be more efficient when we have a risk in doing that? And so the question ends up being, is it the risk in making those changes less than the risk and reward that we would get, from the returns, which you were showing on one of those previous slides? So I can see that would end up being a big challenge. So let me just ask this, Phil, is that people are all on a journey. Big companies are moving down a road, and they have things in place. They have IT portfolios in place. They have a lot of things that they're doing, today, including frameworks. Is that how would you compare yourself maybe to others in the industry? What would be the process? How could, like, if I said I wanted to move forward, where could I start in trying to compare myself, to others, or just compare how mature is my operation?
Yeah. Well, if it's okay with you, send me an email, because my email address is there, and we would come in and do a maturity assessment. I mean, this is essentially our core business, is sitting down with organizations, trying to understand, how do you run your capital planning process today? What do your asset management processes look like in regards to capital planning? How does that work for you? And then we can paint a picture of what we think of the low-hanging fruit opportunities for improvement, and lay out a bit of a roadmap. Say, here's where you're at. Here's how you compare to some of your industry peers, or what we consider organizations using best practices around this. And then we can paint a picture of low-hanging fruit. Like, here's the earliest wins you can get, and then here's some things you might do further down the road as you mature. So we offer that as a service.
That's great. So for those of you that are watching this presentation today, I think that's outstanding. Phil, that Phil just made an offer that if you wanted to have a conversation about your organization and about what you're currently doing, and maybe how it compares to what others are doing, or maybe how you can create more efficiency in your organization, just reach out to Phil at pjones@copperleaf.com and begin a conversation. Start a conversation about how you can begin to create such significant improvements and efficiencies, and really improving the value within your organization. Dan, let me flip that question back to you again. Is that how do you believe that maturity plays out in an organization? How does that play out? How do you become more efficient through a maturing process?
Well, I think, like I said, I've done this for a couple of big chemical companies where we've worked really hard to improve the effectiveness of our capital planning process. And again, it starts with risk management. And I've seen results where Phil talked about reductions in sustaining capital for risk management. A lot of these chemical companies, maybe 40% or so of their capital is sustaining capital for things like safety, health, environment, reliability. Just keep the asset operating the way it's designed to operate. And so, yeah, I've seen savings on that percentage of capital. I think the other thing that an effective process, it really forces you to drive true benefits, and think about true benefits and what part of the scope of the capital is really driving benefits and what isn't. So you do a better job controlling scope on scope on projects, and therefore you save money and you end up having a more executable plan, which I think is absolutely critical. And so I think my biggest maybe need as I was leaving my former company and the company before that, I would say, is we had an effective process, but it wasn't very efficient. And so it took so much labor and intense effort. And, you know, at the end, everybody was just exhausted. And the one thing I really am convinced, and I would recommend people take a look at and take Phil up on his offer, is I believe people will see the value in this pretty quickly. I think the process will be more agile. It will be better. It'll be more effective and more efficient at the same time. And you'll save capital dollars, and your people will be a lot more strategic instead of a lot more, you know, trying to just get the batch done.
Yeah, there really is so much at stake that I really think that it's worth, you know, taking a look at it. And so I wanted to, again, challenge those of you that are watching is that take Phil up on this offer and reach out to him at pjones@copperleaf.com and take a look at your own process and where those successes and opportunities can come from. Hey, listen, thanks for all that you've shared with us today, the strategies and tactics that you have. It's been really insightful. Like I said, I always like bringing together industry you know, together to have conversations so that it's real life and it's applicable to what we're doing. And if you're looking at digital transformation, one of the most important things that we can do is we can look at how do we turn data into actionable information. And you've shared with us today that it has to do with, you know, putting frameworks in place, common values, common measures and methods of assessment, combining that with advanced digital technology to really be able to impact our organizations. And so I've really gotten some good insight out of this today. Thank you guys, you know, for sharing with us. I really appreciate it. Hey, before we wrap things up here today, let's just go to the next slide, and we'll give an opportunity to be able to ask some questions and just see if there's anything, you know, that people want to ask, you know, of this presentation today. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up here today. And gentlemen, I really appreciate your time and your insight. And thanks for joining us, Phil and Dan. This has been a really good discussion. And I look forward to seeing, you know, the growth in the business and how you're impacting organizations around the world with such great digital technology.
Thanks very much, Mark.
And for those of you watching, thank you. Appreciate you being with us today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Bye now.